here and build a 32 by 70 high tunnel. And we've got a couple other outdoor market garden spaces around Fairfield. And then last October, I joined up with a community farm in Hamilton, which you're seeing a picture of right here. They've got one 30 by 72 high tunnel there. And then next week, I'm adding 2 caterpillar tunnels. So I have a little bit of growing experience inside the greenhouses and caterpillar tunnels. I'm definitely not an expert. I really appreciate the Butler County Soil and Water District, giving me this opportunity to speak to everybody. So I hope you enjoy a little bit of the content. Sorry, I'm looking at this other one. Okay, so what we got going on here, I'm just gonna go through some slides. I hope that I can figure this out. I'm a farmer, I'm not a tech guy. So if you have any problems, just yell at me. So the first thing I kind of want to talk about is, your site location, where you're going to decide to even put, your greenhouse, your high tunnel to even begin with. A lot of things that people don't even think about are things like, overhanging trees. You don't want tree branches blowing off in storms, breaking off, poking holes in your plastic. You have to replace that. So one of the first things we did when we took down our old hoop house is we had some overhanging trees that we went ahead and took down so that we would make sure that that wouldn't be a problem. A lot of conversations with a lot of the farmers are, your runoff from your land and or the high tunnel yourself. The one that we have up is a 30 by 72. So you're talking over 2,000 square feet of rain runoff, and all that has to go somewhere. So, you can put rain gutters on the side of it and collect that water, but most of them don't, unlike your house. So all that water is going to be running off and draining somewhere. So that's something you have to take in consideration if you're planting other crops close to the high tunnel or things. You need some sort of drainage so that everything doesn't get washed out. Also, if you have a big slope, going down to the area that you're building your high tunnel on, you got to think about all of that runoff, coming down the hill and actually coming into your growing spaces. I saw farms where, their growing space is actually really saturated for a lot of the years because of all the runoff, because of the existing, slopes of the land. Another one that you need to think about is some sunlight all year long. As the sun, progresses, changes throughout the season, where are you going to be getting shading at? Are you going to be getting full sunlight throughout the day? Are there going to be, buildings, structures, trees, land formations that are going to be blocking, your sunlight? So that's something that you need to keep in effect. Ours is actually set up going east to west, just because location of our property, it was ideal. A lot of times farmers will put them north to south because you get a little bit longer sun travel that direction over the entire tunnel, but it's kind of just up to you and what would fit your conditions best. Soil conditions are a good thing to think about. If you're building on top of an old construction site that has tons of concrete and rubble in the ground, you may want to be thinking about, are you going to be doing raised beds or, growing in containers or something if you can't be using the soil? And the last one that I wanted to bring up is snow load, because unfortunately, sometimes here in Ohio, we do get those really heavy, wet snows, and that can be a really big problem for high tunnels. The ones that we put them up on 4-foot center posts to try and give them the most structure rigidity as possible to be able to handle that weight. Farmers down south, they can put their posts up between 6 and 10-foot centers because they don't have all that weight pressing down on it. But unfortunately around here, sometimes those big winter snows can take down the greenhouses, so you have to build them structural enough that they will withstand the snow load, or consider taking the plastic off during the winter time. So I'm just kind of going to go through, we put this up, or me and a couple of guys I got to help out put up ours in about 2 weeks time frame. So anybody that's looking at this and thinking that's going to be an overwhelming project, it can or can't be. You definitely don't have to have a lot of heavy equipment to do it. We did it with some hand tools and some manual power, but having tractors and lifts and things definitely does make it easier. Here's a 30 by 72 high tunnel being delivered. That's everything for an entire 2,000 square foot structure right there on a skid. all the posts, all the purlins, all the wood, plastic, doors, everything. And we unloaded that semi by hand in about an hour with 5 people. So if you're worried about getting a forklift big enough, you're not going to be able to lift it off with a forklift because the pallets they put them on are like 20-foot long. So forklifts really aren't even an option unless you have super long forks. First thing we did, we took down the old hoop house. The 3 rows were actually planted where they were growing in the old hoop house, and we had tarped off the area where we weren't growing, where the new one was going to go, just to kind of get that weed pressure and everything down under control pretty quick. So this is us building the lifting up the purlins, literally just a couple guys. We built a couple posts to put in the middle for some extra support, and we were able to lift them up on there. Of course, we had to drive our posts in the ground first. They're all drove in on 4-foot centers. Something that makes it a lot easier. All your kits come with a post driver, but I suggest just spending $100 going out and renting the automatic post driver. And I put all 40 posts in about an hour by myself versus swinging a sledgehammer all day. So it makes a big difference. This is kind of a side shot after we got all the top purlins and rafters put on, and we're building the sidewalls. Plastic, pulling the plastic, something you have to think about. A giant sheet of plastic becomes a big giant tarp if there's anything other than about 5-mile-an-hour winds. So your timing on pulling the plastic is something that you really have to take in consideration. Early mornings or late in the evenings usually is the lowest amount of wind, and the time that we had to put it on, we ended up putting it on and was finishing it up late at night, just because that was the only time frame all week long that we weren't going to have strong wind gusts. So that's something you have to take in consideration when building this. I've known people that have literally had to wait for weeks to be able to put on their plastic just because it was continuously too windy. And it's just about done. This kind of shows I went ahead and insect netted the sidewalls, and this one has roll-up sides on it, but I insect netted the roll-up sides, and the end you can see is open with a roll-up end, but that's insect netted in also now. We've got a really big problem with the spotted cucumber beetles around here, and we grow a lot of cucumbers. So that's one thing that I did, is went ahead and insect netted the entire high tunnel. That way the cucumber beetles couldn't get in. So one of the biggest things that you have to think about with the high tunnel is ventilation, because it gets hot really quick. Everybody thinks that, oh, I have a high tunnel, so it's going to be 90 degrees year round and it's going to be perfect. That is not the case. It can go from 30 degrees to 100 degrees in about an hour's time on a sunny day. So one thing you really have to take in consideration is, how are you going to keep your crops cool and comfortable on hot days? How are you going to be available to cool them down on cold days when it gets really sunny? Because when it's 20 degrees outside in the wintertime, there's lots of times that we're rolling down the walls and open to the high tunnel because it's pushing 80-90 degrees in there. So if you're working all day long, you don't want to be worrying about your crops baking in the heat. So you have to have some way to open and close them. This is a pretty intense high tunnel picture right here. This was a flower operation that was actually going out of business with my daughter. We went up and picked up a trailer of cocoa core blocks that we wanted at an auction for this greenhouse that was going out of business. But you can see they had giant fans on one side, and then the other end walls opened up completely to be able to suck air all the way through that. Now that's a pretty impressive example on how to get some ventilation. You can actually see here the tops opened up to let the hot air out of the top too. But here's kind of a more basic version. These are roll-up sides here at the high tunnel over in Hamilton. They go all the way down to the bottom baseboards and actually roll up 5 feet to the sides. And then on my high tunnel here, you can see on the sides, I have what's called drop down sides. So when my sides are all the way up, they're all the way up to that top baseboard there, and then they actually roll down towards the ground. One benefit to having the drop down sides versus the roll up curtains is when you can open your sides up, 5 or 6 foot up in the air where the temperature is actually warmer. So your roll up sides, when you're rolling them up, you're rolling them up from the ground up, and your ground temperature is going to be a lot cooler in the morning. So that's going to let a lot of cold air come right in the baseboards underneath of it. With having the drop down sides, you're letting a little bit warmer air into the greenhouse at that time. So it's not such a drastic temperature change. So that's just something to think about, when you are building these structures. One thing, one thing that works for one person isn't going to work for another. And that's why there's so many different options for these structures. But it's just kind of finding out different information, what's going to work for you. You can see I have 6 ventilation fans in this high tunnel to circulate around. There's 2 passive vents on that end wall. And the opposite end wall, there is a 8-foot man door to get in and out with a 48-inch electric fan louver that's set on a thermostat. That fan really is not for the summertime. It's more for times like this year right now, when I have the sides rolled up and it may get a little bit hot in there before I get a chance to come out. The thermostat kicks on that fan, sucks out all the hot air. But when the sides are rolled down, you got so much air moving, that fan really isn't going to do enough. You get all your ventilation from having the side walls open and having your fans circulating the air around inside the high tunnel. Another thing that you got to think about is irrigation, because with having a big giant sheet of plastic over your growing area, it doesn't ever rain in the greenhouse. Well, it kind of does. This time of year, there's lots of condensation and humidity on these cloudy, rainy days. And yeah, you do get water droplets off the plastic, but it's definitely not enough to irrigate your crops at all. So you have to think about your different options there. In this picture here, you can see I am literally just watering with a yard sprinkler and a garden hose. I had planted some late fall broccoli and cabbage, just kind of as a trial experiment, because I had some extra plants last year when I took over this high tunnel just to see what they would do. So unfortunately, this property, the backflow prevention valve is above ground. So we don't have water irrigation currently during the wintertime because it will freeze and bust. So I've had to truck water in and out in 250-gallon totes throughout the winter. So that's one thing that you need to think about. If you don't have water on site, how are you going to get there? You can see these 250-gallon totes in the back, but once you fill those up, 500 gallons really isn't that much water to be deeply irrigating, 6 or 7 rows of crops throughout the entire winter. So really, you only get a couple waterings out of that 500 gallons, and then you have to worry about bringing in more. So that's something that you really need to consider, is how you're going to be able to water these crops, once you get them planted. So when we built our high tunnel, one thing that we did is we decided to go ahead and put frost-free lines in the ground, and we put water and electric and Ethernet all the way out to the high tunnel when we were building it. That way we'd have water year-round out there and electric. And we figured, since we were going ahead and doing that, we might as well put Wi-Fi internet access out there, because unfortunately the greenhouse structures, with them being metal, do take a lot of your services and stuff away. So you can see here my daughter is planting. In our high tunnel, we use drip irrigation. So I use 3 rows of drip irrigation. There's a little drip emitter every 6 inches. And so we put 3 rows of drip down through the beds, and I have them set up on timers. So literally the garden waters itself, and I don't ever have to worry about that. Makes it super simple, makes it super nice, keeps everything clean. You don't have any overhead watering, creating any fungal or bacterial issues on your plants. So that's one thing that the high tunnels really help out with. Unfortunately, here in Ohio, we have big problems with late blight, early blight, powdery mildew, rust, any kind of bacterial or fungal disease that you can pretty much think of, we deal with here in Ohio. And a lot of that is, coming from the rains and the moisture on your plant. So keeping that moisture off your plants and just directing it straight into the roots really makes a big difference in being able to manage your crop, keep them disease free. It is a little bit of a time investment to be able to set up systems like this, but it can make your life a lot easier. And here's another thing I was kind of talking about earlier. We're getting ready to change over the plastic at the high tunnel over a new place over in Hamilton. And this is one thing that we're going to be doing so that we will have water year round is we're going to be adding gutters and a rainwater collection system to it. So what that will allow us to do is to catch all the water coming off the greenhouse that would normally be running down, onto the crops if they weren't covered. And we can filter that out and put it through our drip system and pump it back down into the roots. So the crops still will be getting, that good rainwater that everybody wants onto the crops, but it won't be going onto the actual foliage. And that'll help out with the water bill some too. There is a little bit of concern about this with the new Health and Modernization Act food and safety guidelines that they're placing. There are some concerns about, contaminants getting into the water and things like that. But if you're not actually applying the water on top of the foliage of the crops that are going to be harvested, you're just applying it to the soil. That kind of helps you get around. You may not want to overhead irrigate with water, that's been sitting around like this unless you're filtering it and clearing it. There are some health and safety issues with that, but that's completely your own practice and up to you what you want to do on it. So that's kind of where I'm going to leave that. One thing else that you have to think about is pollinators. With us putting insect netting all the way around the greenhouse, that means that the bees can't get in. And if the bees can't get in, that means your crops aren't pollinated. Now, yes, some crops do naturally pollinate, and we do grow some crops that don't have to be pollinated, but we still need pollinators to get in there. So one thing that we do is we buy bumblebee hives to put in the high tunnels. They're not actual honeybees. They're more like a bumblebee type. They come in and they really eat the pistils of the flowers a lot and knock off a lot of the pollen. Versus where the bumblebees, kind of collect a lot of it and try to carry it around. These bees are not aggressive towards people, but they're really aggressive towards flowers. They literally will, eat the flowers and knock all the pollen off. So they do a great job at pollinating. But that's something that you're going to think about if you do want to exclude, certain predators or pests in your high tunnel. How are you going to pollinate your crops? I've saw greenhouses that they actually go around with, vibrating toothbrushes, or they have little pollinator wands that go around and knock the pollen off to each of your plants. But if you're planning on, growing a couple thousand plants in your high tunnel, that's going to be quite amount of work to go around and hand pollinate all those. So one thing that we do is we have helper hives that come in and do that little bit of work for us. Pest management is another thing. Even though we're trying to keep the bad pests out by using some of the insect netting, there's still a lot of pests that come into the greenhouse. You're pretty much always going to have aphids and things this time of year. Everything's just waking up, getting active. Nothing else is growing outside, but you have this big, beautiful greenhouse full of greens, and everything's going to want to eat it. So we do a lot of integrated pest management. I release a lot of natural predators. Here's a picture of some ladybugs having a little bit of a good time to increase our population. And this is what produces from that. This is a ladybug larva. Looks like a little tiny dinosaur, I know, but these guys will eat their body weight in aphids every single day. They're probably one of the best pest management, practices that we use on our farm. You can buy them online from a lot of different resources. You can even buy them on Amazon and have them shipped to you. It just kind of depends on the quantities that you're going to need. Different square footage, will help you calculate how much that you're going to need, how many you're going to need to release. But we normally release about, 4,000 to 5,000, I think, 3 times a year. And they do a pretty good job. I haven't noticed a whole lot of them starting to move around, but I'd say within the next couple of weeks, we definitely will start seeing our active population, pop back out of hibernation and get to work. And here's another one that we do, praying mantises. They are great pest management. They will eat just about everything. That's one thing that you have to worry about. They're really not too worried about the bugs that they go after. So if you are releasing beneficial insects, trying to get rid of non-beneficial insects, you may have a little bit of damage from the praying mantises, but we have kind of found out that it outweighs it. We definitely figure that it's way better than spraying tons of chemicals, herbicides, and pesticides on your crop. That's completely up to you. But we're an all organic farm, so we try to use as little, organic herbicides, pesticides, those type of things as possible, as little as possible. Last year, the only thing that I used was BT on our farm the entire year, other than beneficial insects. So it makes a big difference. That's one thing for you guys just to think about. Your bugs can really help take down other bug populations. Crop management and trellising. So this is something that I get asked a lot about, because people look at their backyard garden and see their big, giant, bushy tomato plants that have 500 vines growing off of them and a couple tomatoes, and then they see that I, pack 100 tomatoes into every single row of my greenhouse and wonder, well, how in the world do you do that? So one great thing about these high tunnels is you can order them with your overhead purlins, and you can trellis all your crops from them. This is a picture of tomatoes and just some cucumbers starting out last year. This was probably about the beginning of May, I would assume. So what we do, we have strings all the way down to the base of the plants, and we put clips on here. You can see some of those black clips in the background there, starting down at the base of the plant. So we'll put a clip around the string and around the stem, and we prune off all of the excess leaders and excuse me, the excess suckers that are growing on the plant. So literally there's only one solid vine growing all the way up to the top of the ceiling of the greenhouse. And you can see here some of our cherry tomatoes. I'm starting to lower and lean these. So what the lower and leaning means is that we're actually going to be laying the stems down on the ground. This process allows you to grow a 20, 30-foot long tomato plant, in a 10-foot tall structure. So as your tomatoes growing, you continually are pruning off the vegetative growth on the bottom, opening up all your clusters of fruit to the sunlight so they can start to ripen. As your plants get to the top, you let out more string and literally lay the bottom of the stem on the ground so the plant can continue to grow up towards the top. And now this is just kind of a brief summary of this. I could get more into detail with anybody, specifically. You want to come out and help me prune this summer? I am all for it. It's kind of a pretty big intensive project. There's at least, 15 hours a week just of greenhouse management just for pruning on each of these high tunnels. So it is a lot of work, but the production that you get out of it is pretty incredible. You can go from your average outside, garden tomato plant will produce between like 5 and 7 pounds of tomatoes. We can get between 30 and 40 pounds of tomatoes off, number one quality tomatoes off of each plant throughout the season with just a little bit of pruning and some trellising. So this is a picture of when I'm having to lower the plants. They're, we're 10, 12 foot tall at this point in time. And so we're starting to lay them down on the ground to let more string out so they can continue to grow up towards the top of the ceiling. And one nice thing is being able to work at nighttime in the high tunnel. It's one of my favorite times. Here's a picture of me pruning some cucumbers in the high tunnel at night. I kind of do the same system that I do with the tomatoes on the cucumbers. You can see a single trellis. I don't let them get big and bushy, one solid vine growing up. But you can tell if you look at the number of cucumbers per plant, they're absolutely loaded and will continue to produce like that all season. In years past, I will have cucumber plants that will get 2 or 3 cucumbers on them and then get taken out by either the powdery mildew or the bacteria blight from the cucumber beetles. And so by being able to keep the excess water off of the leaves and keep the cucumber beetles off of these cucumber plants were planted in May, and I just had to take them out in October because I had to get ready to plant for our winter crops. They would have lived, I don't know, if it stayed warm enough, I don't know how long they would have lived. It was so impressive the amount that they produced and the quality just by keeping them up off the ground, keeping good airflow, and keeping the bugs off of them. Well, I guess I went through that a lot quicker than what I thought I was going to. So now we can just kind of get into a question and answer session. And this picture kind of brings up something that I forgot to talk about. You can see in the back of this picture, there's a shade cloth on the high tunnel. So by about the middle of May, that's one thing that you're going to be thinking about. The intense summer sun really heats it up. One big thing that you can do is put a shade cloth over it. This is a 50% shade cloth on top of the high tunnel, and it was actually nicer inside the high tunnel than it was and during the days than it was outside. So a lot of times at 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I would be doing my work in the high tunnel because it was cooler in the high tunnel than what it was outside due to the air circulation and the shade cloth. So that's another good benefit that you guys could do. So I'm going to switch this over so you can actually see me, and we can do some question and answers if you want.
Anthony, can you view the chat? We had some